Okay, great. So a couple of disclosures. I am a co-founder of NeuroUX, which is hosting this webinar today. The slides are my own and were put together by me and not the company. I'm also a co-founder of Keywise and have active funding from the NIH as well as the VA. So I'm going to go through, start out by talking about advantages of remote research today, as well as engagement strategies to keep participants engaged in remote studies, and then go through some sample protocols and use cases. I'm focusing on some of our data today with people with serious mental illness as a use case example to show some variability that we're seeing in remote performance. I have data, and a lot of you may also have data on several other populations. I'd be happy to answer questions about use cases in other populations, but I focus today just on these specific use cases. So what can be assessed remotely? Well, pretty much, anything right now in terms of if we think about different cognitive domains, given advances in technology and thinking about smartphone technologies, wearables, we can pretty much have the ability to assess all the different traditional cognitive domains, as well as more fine-grained way to assess reaction time and get at oculomotor function and eye tracking, and some of these other things we're not able to do with traditional neuropsychological testing can all be done now through remote methodology. And when I say remote today, I'm really referring to assessments that can be done through smartphones. We can also assess factors associated with cognition via ecological momentary assessment survey methods, as well as passive data collection. So things like mood, symptoms, functional behaviors, sleep, all kinds of factors that are going to impact cognition in daily life. And then in addition to just getting kind of a mean score, we can look at aggregated scores over time. If people do repeated cognitive testing, we can combine those and look at an aggregate, which might be a more representative sample of their real world cognition than a snapshot that we get in the lab. We can look at response to treatment and see if there's some real world evidence for when someone is responding to treatment by using a remote technology methodology to assess cognition. And we can also look at variability and the contextual environmental factors impacting our daily cognition, as well as if cognition is in a transient kind of state of fluctuation, or if we're seeing kind of a cognitive decline that's more steady, like a neurodegenerative disorder, for example. And remote assessments can also really help us improve our diagnostic accuracy when thinking about, early diagnostics and just really implications on real world functioning of our patients and research participants. There's several advantages to remote research, and these have really come to the forefront. Remote research has made leaps and bounds since the COVID era. One of the biggest advantages I see is the ability to expand our participant pool and really reach geographically diverse samples. So participants who historically have been unable to participate in our research studies because they are socioeconomically disadvantaged, aren't unable to come to the lab-based visits, live in rural communities, maybe speak a language that is different from the primary research site. But we're really able to expand beyond the location of just where we live and where our labs are located to recruit participants, which I think can really help reduce bias that we see in a lot of the data we've been collecting over the years by getting historically underrepresented samples included in our research. Also can be much more cost effective, less need for staff, less need for in-person facilities, and staff time, staff burden, as well as reduced participant burden as well. So they don't have to spend time coming into our labs for our visits. They can do it from the convenience of their own home, not have that travel time, not have to take off work or get childcare, or caregiver for their spouse if they have dementia, for example. So it can be really convenient for them as well. It's also, we're learning more and more, it is important to assess participants in their natural environments. When people come into the lab, we're assuming they're at their cognitively their best, right? And we're getting a snapshot of that performance at one time point. They also might be having a great morning and say they're not having any mood problems, haven't had any mood problems over the last 2 weeks, don't use substances, whatever it may be. that we're interested in assessing. But when we're able to capture them in the moment in their natural environments, we can really see the impact of their context on their daily cognitive abilities, their daily mood, their daily functioning, and other contextual factors. It also gives us a lot greater flexibility in scheduling and the ability to increase assessment frequency, which I think is a really huge advantage of using remote methods for testing, so that we can test participants not just at the beginning and end of a trial, for example, when we're thinking about clinical trials, but throughout the whole trial or at multiple points throughout that trial, and really see when is that point that the intervention is actually having an impact. Maybe you plan for a 12-week treatment intervention and we see that after 5 weeks, it's being effective, or it's not effective, and then we maybe want to switch treatment in real time within the same participant. So a lot more flexibility, ability to increase scalability, and cost effectiveness are some of the biggest advantages. And when we think about different types of remote research, again, I am referring to it mainly as smartphone-based research. Things that you can do are online surveys like ecological momentary assessment. It's an active data collection, and I'll be giving some examples of EMA data that we have and protocols that we've used. Virtual interviews, a lot of people have switched to remote assessments via Zoom, such as we're doing now, or other virtual methods, even just on the phone. It would phone calls, old school ways to do assessments. We can be doing mobile cognitive testing, and I'll be talking about some of the mobile cognitive testing data that we have today. It's also remote monitoring and passive sensing are also types of remote research that are increasing in popularity because they give you the ability to assess participants continuously and unobtrusively 24/7 without them having to do anything and change their behavior in any kind of way. So an example of that would be fitness tracking, where we give them a watch or they just wear their own fitness tracker and we collect their physical activity and sleep continuously. Lots of passive data collection methods can be captured via the phone as well. So I'm going to share some examples of different active data collection methods today. Just in the nature of time, I focused on active data collection methods, so ecological momentary assessment and mobile cognitive testing. Be happy to answer questions or come back and give another webinar about passive technologies and passive sensing sometime in the future, and answer questions later today about that as well. So what is ecological momentary assessment? It is a way to gain ecological validity by surveying people as they go about their daily routines. So traditionally, ecological momentary assessment surveys are brief surveys that are just quick response choices and that people can complete them in 1 to 3 minutes. They really can ask about how sad are you right now? How stressed are you right now? Or, since the last survey, have you had any alcohol in the last few hours? How many drinks? Are you home? What are you doing? Who are you with? Asking questions about location, social interactions, functioning, substances, mood, kind of anything you want. And they can be done repeatedly throughout the day. They can be done once a day. It really is kind of a design decision that the researcher can make on their own based on the data that they want to collect on how you want to utilize this survey methodology. We've also done some work using micro EMA surveys where you just give one question, and we've done it 5 times a day where participants just get one question. And that's really nice. We have excellent adherence to that, even above and beyond our adherence we get to our longer surveys because it's so quick. They just have to quickly tap on their phone or even on their watch if the survey pops up on their watch, complete the question, and they're done for the day. And an advantage of EMA is really it can reduce that responding bias that we typically see from our traditional survey methodology. And when thinking about our participants with cognitive impairment as well, they don't have to rely on retrospective recall to respond. It's really just kind of responding about what they're doing right now or what they've been doing the last hour or since the past survey. An example protocol would be to give notifications 3 times per day where they have different surveys, multiple times, 3 times per day. The questions, typically what I do when I design my studies is we design the questions to branch in different ways based on how they respond. And the purpose of that is to minimize the number of questions they have to complete. So if they say they're, with other people right now, then we follow up with other social questions, where if they say I'm alone right now, we follow up with other questions about gathering information about kind of why they're alone. We also have our research team complete check-in calls with our participants regularly throughout our EMA survey protocols. And typically we have them check on, this is an example of the NeuroUX user dashboard, which is just really nice and user-friendly to use, because you can see, on this line 1, for example, the sample participant 6061, this is a 7-day protocol. You can see here, you can see when they completed a survey is in green, and when they haven't attempted is in red. And then if they attempted but didn't finish it, it's yellow. And then if it is not applicable, there's white. So there's a nice, easy snapshot to kind of view if people are taking your surveys. And so we have our staff kind of look on after day 1. And if we see people haven't been completing their surveys, then they give them a call or a text message to check in and kind of problem shoot, do some motivational interviewing to encourage them to do that. And then just have them check in regularly with participants as well. And especially keep an eye on those participants who are not responding, and try to minimize the missing data. We also provide compensation for completing our EMA protocols. Typically, we've kind of done $1 per survey. More recently, and for studies with people with younger adults, we've upped that to $2 a survey. But it really just kind of, depends. There's other compensation strategies that can be utilized as well, such as if participants complete more than 80% of the EMA surveys that were delivered, for example, you can give them an extra, say, $20. But all of these compensation strategies really seem to help with our adherence to all of our protocols. So I'm going to go through just a sample study that we did looking at functional disability in middle-aged and older adults with schizophrenia. And when we think about why we want to use EMA in neuropsychiatric conditions, such as people with serious mental illness, patients with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, it's thought that they lack an awareness of their symptoms, but perhaps that's not the case. And self-reports of functioning, as I was mentioning, do seem to have a bias, especially when we have to rely on retrospective recall. So patients usually see their psychiatrist once every 6 months, maybe once a year, and they're kind of asked to describe their symptoms and their functioning over the course between those visits. And that can be really, really hard to do, especially because symptoms fluctuate. Patients can have a really hard time averaging, and some things are just really impossible to remember. And I see a question in the Q&A. How to balance the benefits of EMA research with potential risks for participants' well-being. So we typically do, so to answer that question, in our protocols, usability surveys at the end to see how participants liked the study. Did they feel it was too much? Did it increase stress? Would they do it again? Would they do it for longer? Would they recommend doing it for shorter? And overall, patients don't seem to mind it at all. It really is a trade-off, right? If you're doing a survey multiple times per day, we've even done in people's schizophrenia surveys up to 7 times per day for a week, which is pretty intensive burst of EMA surveys. But, each survey takes 1 to 2 minutes, and versus coming into the lab and being there for, 4 or 5 hours, whatever the protocol may be. So it's a trade-off. But overall, we have very positive feedback from all our participants, and it doesn't seem to negatively impact their well-being. Is there another question? I'm going to actually come back to questions at the end just to make sure I get through the content and stay on track here. So yeah, keep typing your questions and I'll make sure to come back and answer these at the end. So what is the biggest problem in schizophrenia? Most people might say that it's the positive symptoms such as hallucinations or delusions, but really it's this functional disability. So disability in terms of social functioning, vocational functioning, and residential functioning. So a lot of people, aren't able to live independently, aren't able to get and maintain a job, and have a really difficult time with social relationships. And that, when you ask people with schizophrenia what is most distressing to them, it really is this functional disability. So we did a study in 2020. This was led by one of my graduate students, Emma Parrish, here at UCSD, where we used EMA coupled with GPS, which we passively captured through participants' smartphones, to look at the emotional determinants of life space in people with schizophrenia. And we wanted to see if people who are always home, if they're overestimating their functioning, and maybe they're underestimating if they leave the home. What happens when psychosis occurs when they're at home? Or are they only reporting psychosis, for example, when they're home and alone, and maybe there's a suppressive effect on these symptoms based on social context? What's going on when they're leaving their home with their symptoms? And, is it as a symptoms an antecedent or a consequence of leaving the home? So we were able to use GPS to identify a home location to estimate time per day spent at home. And then we were able to also look at times people left the home, as well as for how long they left the home, and then how quickly they came back to the home as well. And when looking at movement patterns of people with schizophrenia, we found that compared to people without schizophrenia, so a control group here, people with schizophrenia were significantly more likely to be at home, which we hypothesized. But interestingly, they were also more likely to leave the home during the day, but for a much shorter time. So they stayed out for a short amount of time and they came home much quicker, meaning they probably just left real quickly to go maybe to the 7-Eleven down the road and, get something to drink, or just out for a walk around the block and back, versus leaving the home for a long period of time, such as going to work or going to do a bunch of errands or whatever else people are doing in their daily lives. And we looked at, does leaving the home or returning change their moods? And here on the blue and the green lines, we have the control participants. And you see that overall, these are negative emotions. We have green is anxious and blue is sadness. And overall, the controls had significantly less negative moods than the persons with schizophrenia in our sample. And they didn't really change as a function of staying home, leaving the home, staying out, or going home. However, in our people with schizophrenia, here on the orange and the yellow lines, the orange line is anxious symptoms and the yellow line is sad symptoms. And we see their symptoms are much lower when they're at home, but their negative symptoms increase when they leave the home. In other words, they get more anxious and more sad when they're leaving the home and when they're out of the home. We see the opposite effect for positive emotions. So here we see that the people with schizophrenia overall have less positive emotions than the control participants, and that their positive emotions seem to change as a function of if they're home or out of the home, is such that their positive emotions are higher when they're at home, and their positive emotions, happiness and relaxation, decrease when they leave the home. Now, this seemed particularly relevant if they're going to a clinical appointment. So we saw that the clinical appointments are the purple lines here, and other kind of reasons for leaving the home are the green lines. But when they were going to a clinical appointment, their sadness significantly increased, happiness stayed the same, but their anxiety significantly increased as well. So thinking about, our patients and the participants that we see, how is this going to affect when they're going to their psychiatry appointments, as well as coming into our clinical appointments for research? They're coming in at an elevated kind of negative mood state, which is going to impact their visit and their, willingness probably as well to come to these appointments. So that was just an example of using EMA in clinical research. And now I'm going to switch over to talking about mobile cognitive testing. So mobile cognitive testing are tests of an individual's cognitive abilities using mobile devices. when I refer to mobile cognitive testing, I refer to it as on smartphone devices. And typically, these tasks are designed to evaluate various cognitive function and designed to be short, repeatable, engaging, enjoyable experience for the participants, and designed to be repeatable over time so that you can give these tests, these short little 1 to 2 minute cognitive tests over, you say, a 7-week burst or even longer period of time, or continuously over an even significantly longer period of time. For easy repeatability. This is an example of one of the NeuroUX mobile cognitive tests called matching pair. So you can see it's just 90 seconds here. And as the participants match the pairs correctly, the grid is going to grow larger and larger and larger and get more challenging. When we think about traditional cognitive testing, there's several limitations. I still think that, a traditional cognitive assessment battery is the best way to assess cognition, but I think that mobile cognitive testing can really supplement that and add a lot of data to it. And I'm hoping eventually mobile cognitive testing will be able to really help streamline our in-person batteries as well. And when we think about these traditional cognitive assessments, people say this is an example of a clinical trial where they come in for their baseline visit and they're just having a bad day. Maybe they couldn't find parking, maybe they didn't get their second cup of coffee, whatever it may be. And their cognitive performance is perhaps lower than their true cognitive ability. Then they go through a treatment trial. 1 year later, they come in for repeat cognitive testing and they're having a good day. And they perform much better than they did on the baseline. What we would infer from this data then is that the treatment was effective. However, if we did repeated cognitive testing over time and average those scores, you can see here perhaps they did repeated mobile cognitive testing for say 7 to 10 days. You can see variability in their cognitive performance over the course of those days. And then you aggregate those scores and their true cognitive function at baseline perhaps is up here. And then a year later, you do it again, and perhaps it's actually a little bit lower. Because cognition in our daily life, is influenced by so many different things, but we're able to kind of average that out versus where in the lab, there's also influence, right, on our cognitive ability, but you're only getting that snapshot of cognitive performance at one time. So an example of a smartphone-based burst design is that you can test often and everywhere. I prefer to let people just test when the notification to take the test pops up on their phone, kind of whatever they're doing, except for driving, of course. You can also ask them to test, go to a quiet place or wait till they're at home to do it if you'd like. But I'm really interested in how context influences cognitive performance in daily life. So it gives you the flexibility to test often and everywhere. Protocols can be really brief, 10 minutes max, coupled with an EMA survey. Will give you a nice snapshot at that one time, which then you can repeat and average. And you can also look at variability in cognitive performance over time. And we've found that with a lot of the NeuroUX mobile cognitive tests we have, performance seems to stabilize over about 6 to 7 administrations. So if you design a protocol where maybe you have a 7-day protocol or let's say a 10-day protocol, that gives you wiggle room for some missed assessment visits, right? Because if we know if it's going to stabilize over 6 to 7 administrations, you give them 10, they miss a few, you still have enough data to really examine that variability in performance, which cognitive variability in and of itself is a known precursor to cognitive impairment. And this is an example of some of the type of, questions you can ask and how you can look at it. I just like this figure. We included this in a book chapter that we wrote a few years ago, where this is an example EMA, a mobile cognitive testing protocol, where they were pinged 5 times during the day at random times, about 2 hours or a little bit, 2 to 3 hours apart. They're asked EMA questions about their emotion, given maybe a activity actigraph or actigraphy tracker to get physical activity and sleep, asked about diet, stress, social contact. And then at that same time, they do mobile cognitive tests. You can look at those relationships at the same time and how they're impacting each other. You can also look at how all of these factors impact cognition later in the day. And from a couple of our studies, we've found that engagement in more passive leisure activities, and primarily that being watching television early in the day, leads to worse executive functioning performance later in that same day. You could also do it kind of the opposite way too, right? You can look at how cognition at this point is going to impact, these other factors later in the day. And it gives you a nice way to look at these lagged relationships as well as the concurrent same time relationships. And this is just a sample from one of my studies where we used 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of the NeuroUX mobile cognitive tests over 14 days. And we just gave them different tests, each about 7 times each over the course of a 2-week period. And it was a 3-time-a-day protocol with EMA mobile cognitive tests. These were in people with bipolar disorder as well as controls. And we had adherence in the bipolar sample at about 70%. In the controls, I believe it was 75 to 80% adherence to this protocol. Now, another question that people ask a lot is, how do we ensure we're measuring cognition and not device usage? So this information is from a really nice paper by Nicosia et al. That was published last year in Behavioral Research Methods. I encourage you to check it out. And they actually built a robot in the lab, and then they tested 26 popular phones, so different variations of the iPhone, as well as all kinds of different Android devices, to really look at device latency. So, each phone has different response times. That's obviously going to influence performance on mobile cognitive testing, especially when you're thinking about performance on reaction time and processing speed variables. And they made some nice recommendations for if you want to have participants BYOD, which is bring your own device, versus give them a study phone, in terms of sample size and cost. So if you want to have a full bring your own device, you're not going to give any study phones out to people, and they can use whatever phone they have. You're going to need a larger sample size, and you're going to have to kind of control for more response time differences based on phone uses there, versus if you want to just provide devices to everyone, which we have done in some of our studies. Well, and it actually can be relatively inexpensive to provide devices, and then everyone's just getting the same phone on the same operating system, same size of phone, just running exactly the same. You need a smaller sample size in terms of worrying about device variability and latency there. It is more burdensome though from a staffing and just an operational perspective to give devices to participants. So I'm a fan of the bring your own device, while making sure that controlling for device differences in analyses is important. And how do we know who's taking the test? Well, there's all kinds of sensors built. There's actually like 26, I think, sensors built into smartphones that make it really easy to assess if it is the person we intend to be taking our tests. You can measure touch IDs, have them, put a password in, capture voice samples, take a snapshot, have them take a video or a picture of themselves during testing. You can also, after the fact, look at outliers in individuals' performance. And maybe if their performance is always kind of like this, and all of a sudden you have a time point where it's way up here, maybe someone else took the test that day and you can throw out that outlier. One thing though, is I'm not sure it's 100% necessary with repeated sampling to really worry too much that it is the person we intend to be taking it. Of course, we want to assume that, most of the time it is the person, but in one of our studies, we had participants speak responses to cognitive tests into the phone. And when we were listening back to score those, we found sometimes we would get a different voice. Once we had someone say, oh, this is just what you do. You just repeat these words, and then another voice answer it. And when we did all our analysis, excluding those time points when it was clearly not the person who's intended to take it, which was less than 1% of the time when we excluded those. And when we included them, there weren't any differences because you're aggregating so much data over time that it didn't make that much of a difference. Another interesting paper by the same group that did the Nicosia et al. Paper, this is Jason Hasselstop's lab in St. Louis, is looking at time of day when measuring cognition. So traditionally, at least at UCSD, we tell our patients and our participants to come in the morning because that's when people are typically thought to be cognitively at their best. But maybe we don't want to actually be measuring people at their best if we're trying to capture impairment or changes in cognition. So this was a nice study where 169 participants who are older adults, aged 61 to 94, completed 4 ecological momentary cognitive testing sessions for 7 days. And they found that in this sample, they had significantly worse memory performance in the evening hours versus the morning hours, which would be expected. But interestingly, there was some preliminary evidence that this worsening in the evening was worse in persons at the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease. This was confirmed by CSF, confirmed AD pathology. And these findings were independent of self-rating mood or fatigue. So this is just more evidence that, there is a lot of ecological validity into measuring people across different times of the day. We can look at diurnal patterns as well, and how that really gives you a nice sampling of overall cognitive ability in daily life. Thinking about adherence and our participants or patients really able to do this, remote research, we've consistently seen adherence to our intensive burst assessments and observational studies, consistently 70% or higher across different patient populations, including people with serious mental illness, mild cognitive impairment, older persons with HIV-associated neurocognitive disorders, older persons with normal cognition, et cetera. And these findings have also been this 70% or higher. This has also been shown in people using some of our NeuroUX studies who are doing clinical trials, but that data is not yet published, so I wasn't able to share that today. The one group that we see lower adherence in is younger adults. So I have a study right now that's participants who are aged 18 to 22. It's a population health study, and we're seeing adherence, down in the 40 and 50 percentile. I've consulted with my colleagues in the field of mobile cognitive testing who's also have worked with this age group and have consistently found that as well. So we think that probably this particular age group is just, they're really busy, right? They're working, they're in school, they're partying, they're hanging out with their friends, they're just not as incentivized and don't have as much motivation to want to complete these mobile cognitive testing protocols in their daily life. Now, when we think about infrastructure that's required to support home assessments, I want to take a moment to talk about web versus mobile apps. So the pros and cons of having a web app. I love web apps because it's so flexible and easy to modify. You can have the survey and the mobile cognitive test just pushed out via text or WhatsApp to their phones, and they just click on a link and are able to complete it. And there's cross-platform compatibility. You don't have to worry about if the new iOS update or a new Android platform update, making the app then have to be re-updated. If they don't have time to get to it right away, they still have that little text notification, like one missed text message. And it's a visual reminder as well to go back and complete the protocol later. The largest disadvantage to web apps is it does require an active internet connection. So in terms of people living in more rural areas, it may not be the best solution. And it is less powerful in terms of features. So passive sensing features, for example, can't be integrated into the web apps. Mobile apps, advantages of that are there's a lot more functionality, given access to system resources. They can work offline, right? No internet's required. And it's easier to integrate wearables and other passive data collection with a mobile app. Some disadvantages are different apps need to be made for different platforms. And the biggest disadvantage I've seen in a study where we're using the apps is the participants, they don't have a problem downloading or installing apps, but when there is an app update, it takes a lot for my research team to be calling and then calling again to make sure they're actually just updating the app, which again is an easy thing to do, but people don't always do it. And if they're not updating the app, then they're going to be getting an older version of the protocol than the one that you intend to administer. Now, when we think about if cognitive domains are all amenable to remote testing, there have been a couple studies that have looked at creating a composite with mobile cognitive tests. One is one of my studies using 6 of the NeuroUX mobile cognitive tests. And we compared it to the NIH Toolbox Fluid Cognition Composite. And we found that the aggregate score of our mobile cognitive tests, they were each administered 9 times over 14 days, were moderately correlated in both people with bipolar disorder and controls to the mobile toolbox fluid cognition. And these are pretty strong correlations when you think about they're totally different tests administered in a totally different modality. But overall, we do think it's capturing a composite here. We're seeing a very similar composite correlation here with lab-based neuropsych in, this was another paper by Nicosi et al., the Hassenstab lab, where they did 3 of the ambulatory research and cognition tests 21 times over 7 days. And in controls and people with mild dementia, they found a nice composite correlation as well. So if you are interested in looking at looking at more global cognition or creating a composite, there is nice evidence that these mobile cognitive tests can provide that. So I'm going to go through an example now of using remote ecological momentary cognitive test of learning and memory in adults with serious mental illness. This is a paper that was led again by a graduate student, Emma Parrish. And participants did EMA surveys for 30 days, 3 times a day, I believe. And then they did this, the variable learning memory task from NeuroUX every other day, so 15 times per day, or 15 times over the study period. And they did 3 different lengths of the list. So we have a 6-word length, 12-word, and an 18-word list. 6-word, as you can imagine, is pretty easy. 12 and 18 can get more difficult. And they have, I think it's 30 seconds to memorize this list of words. Then the list of words goes away. And then it's a recognition memory paradigm where they're asked, was this word on the list? Yes or no. And this can be done immediately after the list is administered or after a delay as well. So for this study, again, they completed the word list 15 different times. So they did each word list length 5 times. And they did 3 learning trials each time. So they did back-to-back learning trials at each administration. These were not done after delay, so it was immediate recognition memory. And the difficulty was counterbalanced, never repeated. None of the lists were ever repeated either. So all the lists were different words. 6-word length, really easy. 18, pretty hard. And hypothesis was that the 12-word length would be very similar to the Hopkins verbal learning test. They were also coupled with EMA surveys. We also did a self-assessment procedure where immediately after each learning trial, we asked, how many words do you think you got right? That was an open response option. And then after the second trial, did you do better than you did on the first trial? And after the third trial, did you improve over the 3 trials? And here are some demographics of the participants. So we had 98 people with schizophrenia spectrum disorder and 70 people with bipolar disorder. The bipolar disorder did have significantly more females than males. compared to the schizophrenia spectrum disorder sample. And the bipolar disorder sample was more educated than schizophrenia sample. They were matched in terms of age. We did see some racial ethnic differences in the sample a little bit. And the schizophrenia sample was much more likely to be unemployed compared to the bipolar disorder sample. And what we found in terms of adherence over the whole sample, we had 75% adherence to the protocol. And this adherence wasn't related to any of the cognitive variables or symptom variables. Interestingly, though, adherence was related to the UPSA-B, which is the UCSD Performance-Based Skills Assessment Brief, which is a test of functional capacity administered in the lab, and it's supposed to get at everyday functioning. And adherence was also correlated with age in this sample. All of our word lists positively correlated with the HVLT. And we didn't see any practice effects for any of the three lists of the words. Here's an example of just two different participants and their data over the 30-day protocol. So you can see in the sample participant 1, very little variability in the overall percent correct they got across the 3 word list trials. They're doing pretty well consistently. Whereas for the sample participant 2, you see lots of variability in their performance, right, over the course of 30 days. Now, when we looked at those questions, those self-assessment questions related to objective performance on the tasks, people thought that they were doing much better on this 6-length word list than they actually were. So the purple bar is objective performance and the red bar is self-report of how well did you do. I mean, they were thinking they were even getting more right than there even were possible to get right here. They also thought they did better than they actually did on the 12 word, and they thought they did slightly better than they did on the 18 word. When we looked at learning across trials, we see little minimal learning here on this 6-length trial. You know, it's pretty easy. People are getting 5 or 6 words right consistently, but they thought they got so much better over the 3 trials, which is really interesting. And then when we looked at, did you think you improved over the 3 trials for the 12 word list, 12 words, they weren't really improving, kind of staying consistently the same in objective performance. But again, they thought they were getting so much better. Interestingly, though, we actually found they were getting better on the hardest trial, the 18 word list, but that they weren't really sure if they were getting better. So we're seeing this disconnect here, right, between actual test performance and self-assessment of performance. We also, in another study, gave people a metacognitive Wisconsin card sorting test. This was done in the lab, and they were asked with the following questions of their performance. They do a sort on the Wisconsin, and then they were asked, were you right? How sure were you right? They're actually then given feedback by the examiner on if they were right or wrong. And then at the end, they were asked to give a global judgment of how well did they do. And you can see here on the left here with people with schizophrenia, and on the right, we have people with bipolar disorder. And their immediate judgments of their response were consistently higher than their actual performances. We also saw that their global judgment of, yeah, I thought I did really well, was better than their actual performance on this test. So 2 different administration modalities showing kind of the same thing in terms of this misestimation. And really the participants with schizophrenia as a group are overestimating their performance. And this can't be a random response or global momentary memory issue, because they are remembering their first impressions as they go through these different trials, and they're aggregating them into an incorrect but congruent global impression that they're doing better in both memory from the variable learning memory test and the Wisconsin. We're also seeing that people with schizophrenia are failing to integrate their feedback. So remember on that metacognitive Wisconsin, they were given feedback on their performance in real time, but they weren't integrating that feedback into their momentary behavior into their global judgments, and still were reporting that they were doing better than they actually were. So we think this global misestimation appears to be based on a momentary misjudgment, but it's not due to random responding or forgetting the immediate estimate. And it's a a response bias in the positive direction. We have right now in review a paper where we asked some of these same questions in people with mild cognitive impairment and people without, and we found that the people with mild cognitive impairment also appear to overestimate their performance. And then the people without mild cognitive impairment who had normal cognition in the sample are underestimating their cognitive performance. So, this is just another example of how we can use these remote measures to answer interesting research questions and look at some, some constructs that are going to be important for helping our patients and, developing interventions to really improve functioning in people with serious mental illness. So I'm going to wrap up here, and then I see there's several questions in the chat. But in terms of just some tips I have and best practice guidelines, I highly encourage you all to integrate some of these methods into your research protocols if you aren't already. I think it really, for all the reasons I pointed out in the beginning, is really can increase, what we can do, increase generalizability, scale our research more, be more cost effective, and encourage you to pilot test out your protocols before you implement them with your research participant. This really helps identify and address any kind of potential issues you're having early on. In terms of thinking about recruitment, with these kind of remote protocols, we can expand beyond our typical local recruitment infrastructures. And there's lots of great online platforms and communities to utilize to get your target population. And so you can do recruitment much more quickly and answer important research questions and disseminate findings much more quickly as well. And then it's important to also consider limitations and challenges specific to remote research and use scientifically validated technologies and methodologies. So there's a lot of, you can download online and through the App Store, lots of different mobile cognitive tests platforms, but there's very few of them that actually have science to back them up and have actually been validated in clinical samples. So it's important to keep an eye out and make sure you're using something that is clinically validated. With that, I will just thank everyone that I work with and all of my funding support, and happy to take questions, and I can look at the questions in the chat as well. Here's my email too. Feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to chat offline at any other time. All right, so I'll just jump over to the chat questions. So one also worries about observer effects. Can EMA engagement improve mental health? So that's a good question. So I actually think it can, kind of like just how when we wear our fitness trackers and we're monitoring our step counts, it's not an intervention per se, right? We're just saying, let's just look at my step counts. But for a lot of people, that can be enough motivation to change your behavior and increase your steps on a daily basis. We have seen as well that just answering questions about daily mood, and especially in some of our EMA protocols with people at risk for suicide, talking about it and reflecting on some of these things can have a positive impact on their mental health. Next question, is there capturing a variability of cognitive function when it comes to calculating the outcomes instead of taking an average over the monitoring? Yes, so that's a big advantage of this mobile cognitive testing as well, as you can look at the variability, right, over performance. And I showed some examples of that. And we typically calculate variability using the MMSD. There's other methods to do that as well. And how can we handle the fatigue effect from doing multiple assessments in one day? Yeah, so we've actually looked at that a little bit, and it kind of varies if we're seeing a fatigue effect on a test by test basis. we've recently finished completing normative data collection with NeuroUX, and we're going to be pushing those findings out here pretty soon. And we are seeing with some of the more challenging tasks that we are getting a little bit of a fatigue effect in that performance after 7 or 8 administrations. So it starts to get worse, which is what you would not expect. But I think that really is on some of these harder tests, people just don't want to do anymore. So that's why, kind of when you're designing your protocols, really trying to balance getting the information you want with not imposing this kind of fatigue effect on your participants. And the next question, if we're primarily interested in cognitive function and are cautious to not overburn our participants, what do you believe are the most important survey questions to ask? And what is okay to leave out? Well, that's a tough question because it really is, protocol specific, right? So based on the aims of your study, if you really just want to look at cognition, you could probably get away with not asking any EMA questions. However, I would recommend asking just a couple basics on if people are home or away from home, and if they're alone or with other people. And then after they complete the tasks, were they distracted or interrupted while they were taking those tasks? So just the home and alone questions, we are seeing consistently across numerous samples and different research groups that people do tend to perform better on the cognitive test when they're home and when they're not with other people, which would make sense. They're probably in a quiet place and not distracted. Participants may provide socially desirable responses or alter their behavior due to the awareness of being monitored. How can we effectively tackle this behavior? So we actually see less social desirability responding with EMA methods than we do with the traditional lab-based methods because they're just at home, or they're not, they're by themselves, or they're not with a researcher or a clinician right in the room. And it's just kind of like, where are you right now? And they're just kind of, we do believe we're getting more honest responding versus the social desirability effect we can often see when people come in and, we're like, oh, how was your depression over these last 2 weeks? And they're like, oh, doc, you prescribed me this new med last time. It's doing a lot better. We're less likely to see that with the remote methods. People really get used to the anonymity of kind of remote assessment as well. And we're also used to being monitored these days, right? I feel like we're monitoring people for good versus targeted ads or monitoring them for a lot of the other ways we're constantly being monitored. Thank you, Stephen, for your positive feedback. And and there's another question on the low adherence in the 18 to 22-year-olds. Was this despite $1 per EMA? Yeah, this is my study where we actually have upped it to $2 per survey, and we're still not getting wonderful adherence. But it's just we try to follow up with the people who don't respond, and they just are telling us they're just really busy and just not as motivated. And that seems to kind of be consistent. These are healthy. It's a healthy population study, though. So I would wonder, I would think if it was a sample of people in that age group who had something going on, diabetes, hypertension, risk for schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, perhaps they would be a little more motivated to get some to participate in the study than our healthy samples. And those are all questions in the chat. Yeah.
Just to add to the last question, in one of the studies you have seen changing the compensation protocol and adding, let's say if you complete more than 80% of the sessions, you'd get bonus amount that has resulted in improved adherence rate. So that is something, if you're testing this age group, that is something we would recommend trying out.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anune, did you have any questions or comments to add, or a couple minutes left here?
No, nothing from my side.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. And nope, that's it for the questions. They just don't go away on my end because yeah, thank you everyone for attending, and yeah, feel free to reach out to me personally if you're interested or have more questions, or to the NeuroUX team. And yeah, have a good rest of your day.